Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, episode number 184, where we are looking at stories from Cromarty. Sincere apologies if this has started twice. I don't know what happened on my screen. It looked like it had already started and then it stopped. And so if there are two strands of this going out, I will have to go back and delete one of them. So welcome to Learn with Lorna. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I am the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, in Inverness, Fort William, Portree and in Wick. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, and High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland. There's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events, but if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are very grateful for that. It's quite a relief to see viewers coming in and people saying good morning, because I'm really not sure, in all of my 184 episodes, I've never had that false start happen before, so I'm very, very glad to see you here, John, Jen, people who are saying hello. So this week is another in our series looking at specific communities in the Highlands, and today we are looking at the borough of Cromarty in the county of Ross and Cromarty. And I know that this is a subject that's generated a lot of interest. A lot of people who watch Learn with Lorna have connections to Cromarty, so I hope you find it of interest. As usual, we're going to start by locating ourselves for those who are not familiar with this area. And I'm entirely sure that by the end of this, some of you will be keen to visit Cromarty if you haven't already. So this time I'm going to start by locating ourselves in using a document from our collections rather than me telling you. In 1962, Cromarty Borough Council and the Cromarty Development Committee asked the School of Architecture and the School of Town and Country Planning at Edinburgh College of Art to survey the town of Cromarty and to create a redevelopment plan. And it's the first paragraph of this finished report that I'm going to start with, which will locate us so that you know where Cromarty is if you're not familiar with it. So they wrote, "The borough of Cromarty is situated on the eastern seaboard of the county of Ross and Cromarty, and at the most northerly point of the Black Isle. Bounded to the north and the west by the Cromarty Firth, and to the east by the Murray Firth, this borough is approached by road from the south through the parishes of Rosemarkie and Rosollis. Cromarty is 22.5 miles from the county town of Dingwall at the southern end of the Black Isle, and 21.25 miles from Inverness. Neighbouring towns of importance are the cathedral town of Fortrose and the fishing town of Och." So a small town on a bay on the Black Isle, just across from where I'm sitting right now. If I moved slightly, I would be able to see across to the Black Isle. Sitting on a natural harbour, famously guarded by 2 headlands called the Suitors, and we will come back to the Suitors, very distinct landmarks. So it's a very beautiful town, and the second statistical account published in the 1800s goes further in its scene setting about Cromarty, saying, "It is surrounded by a highly picturesque country, rich in prospects which combine the softer beauties of the lowlands with the bolder graces peculiar to an alpine district." So a beautiful setting, and it is a particularly beautiful town with some spectacular buildings. If anyone is watching in Cromarty, then I'm sure that they will be able to testify to that. And also famous for those not in the area for giving its name to part of the shipping forecast as well. So like many of the boroughs in the Highlands and Islands and boroughs further afield, Cromarty sits on the coast, meaning that trade has played a significant role in its growth, but also the change in trade has caused a significant part of its decline. And I've said this so many times when I've done these episodes looking at certain settlements and communities, I find it really fascinating seeing the forces and the influence that have shaped the stories of our boroughs in the Highlands. So war constantly shaping the story of Fort William, or faith and religion shaping the story of Tain, trade in Inverness. And all of the boroughs have their different journeys to become their places of importance. And some of them have some interesting twists, as we will see with Cromarty. And as you'll see, I think Cromarty really punches above its weight in terms of what the town has to offer and has had to offer. So I wanted to start this story by sharing a little bit about why it's called Cromarty. This is from the first statistical account. The want of access to any particular record makes it difficult to trace with accuracy the etymology of the name Cromarty. It is generally allowed to be Gaelic, denoting crooked bay, and as this interpretation seems natural, it may conclude it to be a pretty just one. The Gaelic name of the place is Cromba, or Crooked Bay, and the description of the bay on which the town is situated, having a noble winding curve, evidently favours the etymology of this. The extent of the parish is from 7 to 8 miles in length and from 1 to, trying to read the writing there, from around 1 in breadth. It is bounded by the Bay of Cromarty on the north and by the Murray Firth and the parish of Rosemarkie on the east and west. So echoing what we had in that 1962 report. And I want to start the story of the early years of the borough by reading an extract from a guidebook that we have a copy of. Our borough minutes start in the 1800s, so I'm turning to other sources. If you've watched these episodes frequently, you'll know that often I go to the borough minutes first when I'm looking at a borough, but they're quite late starting for Cromarty. So I'm going instead to this guidebook written in 1991 by the Cromarty and District Community Council, published by Cromarty Courthouse Museum, who I'll come back to at the end, with input from experts including Dr. David Alston, who I've referred to many times during this series. So this is their description of Cromarty's early history. Lying at the very tip of the Black Isle, Cromarty is an ancient town of much character and charm. The strategic importance of Cromarty's natural harbour, coupled with the economic importance of its rich agricultural hinterland, so again echoing that description of the two elements, that coast, but also the rich agricultural land behind it that make up Cromarty's story, suggests that Cromarty was a centre of royal authority since at least the 10th century. Certainly its importance in the 11th century is evidenced by the mention in Andrew Winton's 14th century chronicle of Macbeth as Thane of Cromarty, Thane of Murray and King of Scotland. Emphasising its economic importance in the 13th century was its creation as a royal borough. So a royal borough around the 13th century. We'll come back to that. By this time it had a castle approximately on the site of Cromarty House, which protected the ferry crossing, the King's Ferry, an important part of the route north. Now you might remember when we looked at the story of Tain that I spoke about the royal pilgrimages to Tain to worship and the fact that James IV went there just before he died in battle. And this is referenced here as well. James IV is said to have used the ferry out of Cromarty 18 times on his way to worship at the shrine of St Duthac in Tain, the last time just weeks before his death at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. So again, the way all the boroughs, their stories tie up together, that route that they create north. The original fortification of Cromarty Castle was probably made of wood, but in 1490 permission was granted to erect a stone castle. This was extended in the 1640s, but demolished in 1772 to make way for an elegant mansion house. The castle and the area surrounding the town were controlled by a royal official, the Sheriff of Cromarty. The hereditary sheriffs were originally the Moats, but they were replaced in the 14th century by the Urquharts, the most famous of whom was Sir Thomas Urquhart, writer, translator of Rabelais, and royalist supporter in the Civil War, who apparently was said to have died laughing at the Restoration. The Urquharts held the estate of Cromarty until the 1670s. So I mentioned that Cromarty became a royal borough around the 13th century. It says in the 13th century, Cromarty was a busy place with a thriving economy, but trade declined in the 14th century. Its status as a royal borough was reconfirmed in the 16th century, but royal borough status was given up in 1685, but Cromarty continued to be of some importance. Its wealth was based on the export of grain and on thriving business, herring and salmon fisheries. But the failure of the herring fishery in the early years of the 18th century brought about a period of distress, but the fishery revived after about 1815. So a lot to unpack there, as there always is if I'm reading a long extract. very interesting insight into the giving up of the royal borough status. Now, I haven't seen that, and I haven't investigated fully all the boroughs yet, so maybe I'll come across it again. But to my mind, that's quite unusual to give up voluntarily royal borough status. I think it looks from various pieces of reading that I've done that it was expensive for them to retain it, and in a period of declining trade, then it would become very prohibitively expensive. Also there in that summary of several hundred years, the impact of the ups and downs of the economy and trade. So Cromarty, as we'll see, is very much a story of booms and busts. And also attempts to change that cycle. So we see huge periods of prosperity, and then we see periods of decline and difficulty, and then constant reattempts over the centuries to turn that fortune round and to keep the prosperity going. I'm going to use quite a lot today from our Jane Durham collection. Now, you may remember some time ago I did a Learn with Lorna on Jane Durham and on the collection of records of hers that we hold. An extraordinary historian, researcher, campaigner for historic buildings. Just another fascinating woman, much like Margaret McDougall, as I usually say she is. And this is from our Jane Durham collection. When in 1725, Daniel Defoe, famous author of course, wrote that Cromarty was noted for being the finest harbour with the least business of perhaps any in Britain, he was repeating a view which had been expressed a number of times in the preceding centuries, and many of the lairds of the small Cromarty estate had sought to rectify this situation with more or less realistic schemes for the development of the town and its harbour. So again, that impact of the huge periods of trade, and then the people who have then, when it's declined, have tried to put something in place to redevelop and reinvigorate the town. The most ambitious was undoubtedly, of those who tried to reinvigorate it, was undoubtedly that of the great 17th century eccentric Sir Thomas Urquhart, who would have transformed it not only into a manufacturing, trading and commercial centre, but planned to bring men of learning from throughout Europe to live with him in his little town. And that is exactly why David Alston's book is called My Little Town of Cromarty. It was not, however, until the second half of the 18th century, when the estate was acquired by George Ross of Pitcairn, that sustained development took place. And so impressive was the transformation of Cromarty that by the 1790s, Sir John Sinclair, the organiser of the first statistical account of Scotland, felt that Cromarty might overtake Inverness as the general mart of the north. So we've spoken a little bit there about Thomas Urquhart and his role, but the main person to speak about here is George Ross of Pitcairn. He lived from around 1700 to 1786. He was a confidential clerk to Duncan Forbes of Culloden, who was the Lord President of the Court of Sessions. I've again spoken a lot about Duncan Forbes over the years. George Ross was not only a solicitor and confidential clerk, but he was particularly wealthy due to his business as an army agent, supplying resources and equipment to regiments during the 7 Years' War and the wars of the Americas. So he had become particularly wealthy, and he purchased the Cromarty estate, and he put substantial amounts of money into redeveloping Cromarty, using his professional contacts, such as government bodies, but also his local contacts, including people such as local merchant William Forsyth. He was a merchant and also a trader, promoter of flax spinning, of linen weaving, and various other things. So George Ross had not only the financial backing, but the ability to pull people who he thought would be useful. And over a 20-year period, this is what George Ross did in Cromarty. These are rough dates. 1768 to 72, improvement of Cromarty Mains Farm, planting of the Hill of Cromarty and reclamation of the moorland, introduction of lace making, building of brewery. 1772 to 73, building of Cromarty Courthouse. 72 to 74, building of the hemp works and building of Cromarty House. 1775 to 76, introduction of pig rearing, nail and spade works. From 1776, further farm improvements. 1781, nail and spade works expanded. 1783, building of the Gaelic Chapel. 1784, building of the harbour. So you really get a sense of the number of things he was involved in. Now, in that Jane Durham collection, she talks about each of those developments in turn, researching and collating information about all of those things that Ross was involved in. Listen to this extract that speaks about the hemp works, which was one of Scotland's first factories. The hempen manufactory. We will consider, she says, each of Ross's enterprises in turn, beginning with the most important. The hemp manufactory, managed by William Forsyth, again a very, very key player in Cromarty's history. Forsyth had already done much to promote the spinning of linen yarn from imported flax, chiefly as an agent for the British Linen Company. He had, in the 1750s, proposed the establishment of a weaving establishment at New Tarbert across the Cromarty Firth, using this location because he was seeking support from the commissioners of the annexed estates who controlled the estates that had been confiscated after the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745. His plan was not taken up, but details of it survive, from which it appears that he had planned in a 9-year period to train 900 girls as spinners, 180 boys and girls as weavers, and 36 boys as hecklers, bleachers and dressers of yarn. When the British Linen Company began to withdraw its support for spinning in the north of Scotland from around 1770, the whole development of textiles in the area was threatened. So Ross comes in with this money, with these ideas, but picking up on Forsyth's already formed ideas and things that he thinks could work. So he's realised that it's not going to work in New Tarbert. Ross and Forsyth seem to have recognised the possibility for utilising the skill in spinning which had been built up over the previous 20 years, and Ross advanced the capital for the building of a factory which would weave hemp imported from the Baltic. The cloth produced was mostly made into bagging and sold in London, probably through Ross's contacts there. Some linen continued to be woven, but there is a marked drop from the mid-1770s. It's important to note, Jane Durham says, that the hemp works was a hand loom and not a mechanised factory. Such factories were found in large areas of Scotland, particularly Dundee, but the Cromarty works is earlier and probably larger than the others, and is the best example to have survived. It consisted of 4 ranges of buildings, each 2 stories in height, arranged in the form of a square. In the centre was a boil house, and by the 1820s, if not earlier, there was a 5th range outside the square. Towards the end of this extract, she says, in 1781, there were over 600 women spinning yarn for the factory and 250 people working within the walls. If Forsyth's estimates at his New Tarbert plan were correct, 600 spinners would supply the yarn, with 120 weavers, and a description of hemp working in Inverness in the 1790s indicated that of 1,000 workers, 130 of them were weavers. So a huge, huge undertaking. And in the late 1700s, the town was working substantial amounts of hemp imported from Riga, St. Petersburg and other areas, and creating bags and sacking, much of which was then sent for use on the slave plantations in the Caribbean. Cromarty, like everywhere else at this time, benefited substantially from money made in the slave plantations of, at the time, the West Indies. And indeed there was a plantation called Cromarty. Those factory buildings are still standing. They are very beautiful. But if you're interested in finding out more about Cromarty's connection to the slave economy, then again, Dr. David Olson is absolutely the person to go to. His book, Slaves and Highlanders, talks on this subject. So George Ross introduced this hemp factory, but also he introduced new farming practices, brought lace making to Cromarty, and opened a brewery to produce strong ale and porter, which apparently was an attempt to wean the workers off whisky, which was stronger. As I said already, this period also included the introduction of a nail and spade works, introduced pig breeding and pork curing business, and apparently The pork curing business was unlike any other in Scotland, with over 200 Hampshire hogs. Now, George Ross, I'm talking about him in sort of glowing terms of what he was able to achieve for the town, but his businesses were not all successful. But Jane Durham notes that by 1775, George Ross owned 57% of Cromarty Shire, so not just the town, but the county. And interestingly, and I did find this quite fascinating, Sir John Sinclair, who compiled the first statistical account, noted that George Ross's tenants were seldom, if ever, cleared, and that their houses were of a higher standard than elsewhere. Interesting. Much of Cromarty's 18th century look is thanks to George Ross. So the courthouse, the Gaelic church, Cromarty House, those buildings which still stand, a lot of it is due to George Ross. Now, I've mentioned the Gaelic church a couple of times. Now, the Gaelic church was built to accommodate all the Gaelic speakers who moved into Cromarty to work as a result of all of this industry being brought into the area. And this is how it was described. Cromarty in the 18th century and before was a lowland, not a highland town. Again, that interesting distinction of where people think they sit geographically. Cromarty's links were with the Murray coast rather than with the nearby highlands, and its language was a modified form of northeast Scots, with the exception of the fisher community who spoke their own dialect, and we will absolutely come back to that. This said, one had not to travel far into the Black Isle to enter Gaelic-speaking areas, and there were owners of property in Cromarty in the late 17th and early 18th centuries with both Gaelic and English forms to their names. However, it is likely that it was the Gaelic speakers who were bilingual, and it is correct to describe Cromarty as a Scots-speaking town. This situation began to change in the 1770s, according to the parish minister, for two reasons. First, many Gaelic-speaking labourers were employed on the improvements on George Ross's Cromarty estate. It is said that between 1300 and 1400 came in 1 year. Some of these settled in the parish. And then secondly, the establishment of the hemp works attracted many Gaelic speakers from neighbouring parishes and provided them with stable employment. And so it was a result of this influx of Gaelic-speaking population that the Gaelic Church was established. I mentioned earlier one of the other things George Ross was involved in was the construction of the harbour, and that resulted in a substantial increase in trade through the port. But of course, fishing had always been important to the community, and Fishertown forms a distinct part of Cromarty. So here are some thoughts on that. In the late 17th century, an area of the town above the links was known as Pickleton, and there were families of fishers, Hossacks and Skinners. Other families, including the Hoggs and the Watsons, are mentioned as seamen. According to Hugh Miller, salmon was an early export from Cromarty, and herring fishing flourished from at least the 1680s and probably much earlier, until sometime before 1715. They go on to talk about those associated industries that go alongside fish production, fishing, and those kind of coastal economies. Evidence from the rest of Scotland suggests that while there was fishing in Cromarty from an early time, there was, as elsewhere, both a shortage of good quality salt and an unreliable market for large-scale enterprise. And it is likely that the Cromarty fishers relied more on fishing with short and long lines for whitefish, drying any fish not used and sold immediately. It was not until after 1815 that the herring boom hit Cromarty, and by 1824 it was the 8th largest centre for herring curing in Britain, exporting 20,000 barrels in 1824 alone. The fisherfolk of Cromarty were a distinct group with their own dialect, accent and traditions. And if you're interested in more on the Fishertown dialect, then you can read about it and you can also hear recordings of it on our website, Ambala. It seems possible to me that with all of these industries coexisting, locals living and working alongside people coming in from all over the country, so English ploughmen brought in to try new farming techniques, there were the Gaelic-speaking incomers from neighbouring parishes, the women who were brought into the area to teach lace making. It seemed to me as I was reading about all of this that I thought surely there's potential here for a bit of unrest, a bit of people rubbing up against each other. And that is visible to some extent within both the church records and the court records. And incidentally, for those of you who are interested in the story of Cromarty, church records, although the borough records are quite late, church records from Cromarty start in the 1670s. In 1777, the Kirk Session considered a case of drunkenness and Sabbath breaking by a group of weavers at the factory who had met in one of their houses, which was being run as a private drinking house. They met and stayed together until 3 a.m. on the Sabbath. And a fight had broken out when a Donald Ross started swearing and cursing the others. He was damning them, apparently. So like, it's not bad enough drinking till 3 a.m. on the Sabbath, you're then damning people as well. We can then see a couple of years later a brawl fought between groups of gardeners and weavers, which went to court. And justice was dispensed from 1773 onwards in the newly built Cromarty courthouse. But of course crimes were being committed and investigated and punished before that, with people being secured in the castle cellars and executions taking place in various locations, including on Gallow Hill. And there are some really dramatic stories associated with crime at this time, such as the case of Andrew Forbes, who was accused of a myriad of crimes, including adultery, theft, and the poisoning of his wife, perjury, various other things. And it's said that he was put into the pit of Cromarty Castle, but tunnelled his way out and escaped before being recaptured and hanged as a lesson. And there are records of trials held in Cromarty Courthouse, but there are also within our wider Sheriff and High Court process papers evidence of crimes committed by people belonging to Cromarty. Cases such as this from 1733. Whereas, by information signed and presented to me setting forth that Bernard Clunes, commonly called merchant in Cromarty, did write and send a letter challenging Ludovic Gordon, merchant in Inverness, to meet him at a duel in combat, and that some short time thereafter, so far duels are accepted, but short time after, the said Ludovic Gordon then received a message to take care of himself in regard that the said Bernard Clunes was coming with firearms and private weapons to take the said Ludovic Gordon in his own quarters, which accordingly he did. Which he did immediately, but his wicked intentions were prevented by a concourse of people in the said Ludovic Gordon's quarters, who saw the pistol in his breast and stopped his bad designs at that time. It's a very dramatic story, and when I looked through the court papers, I also found cases of rioting and outrage, of causing great effusion of blood by beating of a barbarous and cruel nature. So all sorts of things in the court papers. Now, Cromarty Courthouse, which again is a very beautiful building, and I'll come back to that at the end. Cromarty Courthouse was altered in the 1840s to allow for prison cells and for a prison keeper to be able to be resident. And I was fascinated to learn from Anne McIntosh, who is a local historian, member of Inverness Local History Forum, a user of the Highland Archive Service and a viewer of Lorna, that her ancestor, also called George Ross, had served as the prison keeper in Cromarty. And his wife Janet, who had been born in around 1810, served first as a lady's maid at Cromarty House and then as matron at the prison when George took on that role after leaving the army. It's always nice when you hear those connections to what you're researching. So thank you, Anne, for sharing that with me. Interesting there to see that Janet, before going on to become the matron at the prison, had served in Cromarty House, which makes me wonder if she had used the famous servants' tunnel into the house. By now, in the story, the mid to late 1800s, Cromarty's fortunes had changed. So we've seen already that boom and bust, those all of those industries that George Ross brought in, and then a decline in trade before that as well. And then the coming of the herring industry and the way that changes. And as I said at the beginning, it's very much a story of huge triumph and then decline. And this is how Jane Durham describes the mid to late 1800s. Despite all that had been achieved, decline came, both with a failure of the fishing in the 1830s and later the closure of the hemp factory, which had gone on to do rope making, incidentally. In 1843, a visitor described it as a miserable place in the last stages of decay, and Hugh Miller, by the late 1840s, felt that it was becoming a deserted village. Underlying the success, there had been a number of problems. Chief among them was the fragility of the textile industry. Cromarty had neither water power nor had coal been found locally, and so there was no possibility of the factory becoming mechanised. Jute was soon to replace hemp as the raw material for bagging, and so a major reorganisation of the industry would have been required, and the control of the enterprise now lay in London rather than in local hands. In 1841, 117 persons were employed in textile trades. So in 1841, there's 117 of them. The 1851 census records James Nell of Shore Street employing 50 men and 42 women. And then by the 1861 census, there are only 6 people in textile trades. So you can see going from 117 to 6 people in a 20-year period. A second problem related to the potential of the Firth as a naval base. In 1725, Daniel Defoe had noted that it was doubtless a harbour or a port able to receive the Royal Navy of Great Britain. And over 50 years later, George Ross had entertained hopes that the government one day will establish a dry dock near the harbour for repairing ships of war in their northern expeditions. In the 1790s, Sir John Sinclair of Statistical Account fame had said, "Surely the government will see the utility and the vast importance of a naval establishment at this port." But by 1840, nothing of this kind had taken place, and the full potential of the Firth had gone unrealised until the 20th century. So we can see that there are missed opportunities in the story. But before I come right up to date, and also to when we did realise and utilise Cromarty's harbour to the best of our ability, I want it would be remiss to go any further without speaking about Cromarty's most famous son, Hugh Miller. There's been a huge amount written about Hugh Miller, and I know that many of you watching will already be very familiar with him. So I'm going to share just an overview summary of his life from Ambala. Hugh Miller's father was a shipmaster who was lost at sea in 1807. The boy was brought up by his mother and his uncles. Intelligent and an avid reader, but rebellious at school, Miller preferred to wander along the coastline, where he developed an interest in geology. After a dispute with his schoolmaster, he left school and went to work as a stonemason in Edinburgh, but the dust damaged his lungs. He returned to Cromarty to work as a monumental mason and began to write articles for the Inverness Courier and other journals. In 1830, Miller discovered fossil fish in the old red sandstone at Cromarty, and his interest in geology developed into a serious study. He became an accountant with the Commercial Bank in Cromarty in 1834 and married Lydia Faulkner Fraser. They had 5 children. The first, Elizabeth, died in infancy. Their eldest daughter was the writer Harriet Miller Davidson. And Hugh Miller, influenced by his mother, had always been fascinated by local history and folklore, and his first book, Scenes and Legends of the North of Scotland, was published in 1839. Miller's interest in church affairs and his view that the Church of Scotland should be free to choose its ministers without interference from landowners brought him to the attention of leading evangelists, and he was asked to edit a new evangelical newspaper, The Witness. Miller moved with his family to Edinburgh to take up this position and went on to become the proprietor. He was at the forefront of the disruption when the evangelicals left the Church of Scotland and formed the Free Church. And we have a very, if you look up David Octavius Hill's painting of the formation of the Free Church, you'll see Hugh Miller right at the front of it. Hugh Miller continued to write and published books on natural science and geology, notably the Old Red Sandstone, as well as an autobiography, My Schools and Schoolmasters. Miller struggled with the new ideas coming out of evolution, but endeavoured to reconcile science and religion, his 2 big passions, of course. He overworked and socialised little. his lung disease flared up again and he suffered bouts of depression, possibly as a result of a neurological problem. And finally, on the night of the 23rd, 24th of December 1856, thinking himself going mad, he shot himself and was buried in the Grange Cemetery in Edinburgh. I found it interesting to note in the work of Dr. David Alston that he, when he was at school, sat next to a black boy from the West Indies, and they both had high tempers apparently, and Hugh Miller had stabbed him in the thigh. But again, just another link there between the Caribbean and Cromarty. But Hugh Miller's legacy has been long-lasting, and he is one of the most famous men to come out of the Highlands. So, I'm aware that I've gone over. So Cromarty's story, as you can see, is one of huge prosperity and construction of the most stunning buildings. But also it's a story of decline, of changing fortunes and drops in trade. Cromarty came to importance again in the years of the two world wars, and that harbour that everybody was commenting on the potential of it, that came again to the fore, as it had done in bringing in hemp and exporting grain and salted fish. It again came to the fore in both world wars. The Cromarty Firth's deep natural harbour meant that the whole area was of use to the navy, and Cromarty became an important naval base in both world wars, with coastal defences mounted on those very distinct headlands, the Souters, and those coastal defences are still visible. The area today is still used as part of that deep natural harbour is still of importance, used today for the construction and repair of North Sea oil rigs. And there was a huge amount of restoration of property and infrastructure done to Cromarty in the second half of the 20th century, and it is now considered the best, one of the best, I've read both, so let's say the best, preserved 18th century town in Scotland. It is an absolutely beautiful place to visit, just even to wander around some stunning buildings. And if you do go, if you've never been before, please go to Cromarty. If you do go, please visit the wonderful Cromarty Courthouse Museum to find out more about life in the area, in the parishes of Cromarty and Rosollis, also more about Cromarty's trade, its courts and its links to slave ownership. And then also please do go and have a look at Hugh Miller's birthplace cottage and museum, built by his great-grandfather in the 1700s and now maintained by the National Trust for Scotland. As I said right at the beginning, Cromarty, I think, punches above its weight still. A very beautiful place. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening to me wittering on, as usual. Sorry again for the slightly confused start. I had no idea what was going on with my computer. I hope you can join me next week, where I will be looking at the Fraser of Lovat collection, a huge collection that came into us in the last year or two, is now fully catalogued and available online, all sorts of gems in that collection. So I hope you can join me for that. Thank you for joining me today. And a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. If you're able to donate towards our work, we are very grateful for that, and thank you to those of you who have done so. Thank you.